Title: The Sect Iceberg. Opening. Sometimes faith becomes a support, giving a person comfort, a purpose, a sense of meaning. But there are times when it turns into an instrument of power, a weapon in the hands of those who call themselves prophets and demand worship. In this iceberg, we will descend to the bottom of religious fanaticism, from superficial spiritual practices to closed communities where faith becomes torture, and the leader is the absolute truth. This is the sect iceberg, and the deeper we dive, the scarier it gets. Level 1, the tip of the iceberg, Ku Klux Klan, KKK. The Ku Klux Klan is a white supremacist organization, infamous for its violent activities and propagation of hate. It emerged in 1865 after the American Civil War. Initially, the Klan positioned itself as a social club with radical views toward people of different skin colors. However, it soon transformed into an organized group of vigilantes whose actions were steeped in hatred and had a significant impact on society. The primary targets of the Ku Klux Klan's attacks were African Americans and those who expressed support for them. The hate crimes committed by the organization's members were numerous and brutal. As a result of their actions, the government was forced to adopt a number of legislative acts aimed at suppressing the Klan's activities and recognizing it as a threat to public order. The second Ku Klux Klan, which became known as the Second Klan, appeared in 1915. Its founder was William Joseph Simmons, inspired by the film The Birth of a Nation. The organization broadened its activities and began to show hostility not only towards African Americans, but also towards Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Although the second KKK was not as violent as its predecessor, it successfully used propaganda to spread its ideas. The organization's structure was decentralized, which led to its eventual collapse. The third Ku Klux Klan emerged in the 1950s in response to the growing civil rights movement in the U.S. By this time, the organization had already fragmented into many small groups without a centralized structure. However, the third KKK continued to spread violence and hatred, using the context of the fight for African American equality to revive its activities. One of the most famous acts of violence associated with the Third Klan was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The organization was also suspected of involvement in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, but these charges were not proven. The activities of the Third Klan caused widespread public condemnation and led to the adoption of new laws aimed at combating racial discrimination and terrorism. A characteristic feature of the Klan was their eerie attire, pointed hoods and white robes, which became a symbol of racism. Although the organization's influence has significantly weakened, the ideology it spread still lives on in other groups. Church of Scientology. In the West, there is a famous saying, "You don't get rich on science fiction. To get rich, you have to create a religion." This quote is attributed to the science fiction writer L. Ron Hubbard, who, in 1954, did indeed found a new religion, Scientology. Today, Scientology has tens of thousands of followers worldwide. The main concept of the cult is built on the idea of reincarnation and the representation of man as an immortal spiritual being called a thetan. The main text of the teaching is Hubbard's book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. Scientologists believe that every person carries traumas from past lives, and only through special purification sessions, called auditing, can one achieve spiritual freedom. During auditing, a device called an e-meter, resembling a lie detector, is used. It is believed that with its help, one can track a person's emotional reactions to certain words. The ultimate goal is to achieve the level of an operating thetan, a state of spiritual purity and control. The oddities don't end there. At the higher levels of Scientology's hierarchy, pseudo-scientific and fantastical teachings are presented about an extraterrestrial being named Xenu, who, millions of years ago, dumped the souls of beings into Earth's volcanoes. These souls became the thetans inhabiting people's bodies, causing their suffering. Access to this knowledge opens only after completing expensive courses. Some former Scientologists claim to have spent tens of thousands of dollars on them. Numerous scandals have erupted around the Church of Scientology. The organization's central complex, where hundreds of people live, is known for its secrecy. Reports mention harsh conditions, forced labor, restricted movement, and cruel control. One of the most resonant cases is the mysterious death of Lisa McPherson within the church walls. Behind the facade of spiritual growth are hidden manipulations, intimidation, financial pressure, and psychological abuse. And although Scientology is officially recognized as a religion in some countries, more and more people view it as a cult with a rigid hierarchy, high monetary contributions, and questionable methods. Church of the Lamb of God. The Church of the Lamb of God, a schismatic and radicalized branch of the Mormon fundamentalist group, the Church of the Firstborn, is known for its adherence to polygamy and a violent ideology. The founder of this separate faction was Orville LeBaron, one of the many sons of the original branch's leader. Disillusioned with his position as the second person in the organization, Orville secretly began preaching that he was the true prophet. He managed to persuade some followers, for which he was exiled. In response, Orville launched a campaign of violence and revenge. In 1972, he organized the murder of his brother, Joel LeBaron, who was then leading the main church. This murder was the first in a long series. Orville revived one of the scariest elements of early Mormon theology, blood atonement, the idea that forgiveness of sins is possible only through the shedding of blood. He applied this method literally. He later ordered the killing of another brother, Verlan, who had gone into hiding with his family. To get to him, Orville orchestrated an armed attack that resulted in the deaths of bystanders. He also ordered the murder of members of his own family. Even after Orville's death, his cult continued to exist under the leadership of his son, Arturo. Although the organization itself eventually fell apart, the trail left by the LeBarons is still considered one of the bloodiest in the history of modern cults. Bergholtz Amish Community. The Amish community in Bergholtz, Ohio, split off from traditional Amish society and turned into a closed, rigid cult under the leadership of Bishop Samuel Mullet. He started with the idea of an even stricter, more conservative form of Amish life, an absurd task in itself, given how closed and traditional the Amish are initially. In 2001, Mullet was ordained as a bishop, but in violation of tradition, without the participation of 3 other bishops, as custom requires. His power within the community quickly became absolute. By 2006, Mullet began persecuting those he believed violated order. He expelled several families without explanation. Higher religious authorities overturned these decisions, allowing the expelled to join other communities. This angered Mullet, and he began a series of attacks on other Amish, including those who had left Bergholtz. The attacks included forcibly shaving beards and cutting hair. In Amish culture, this is a grave insult. Federal authorities convicted Mullet and his followers of hate crimes and conspiracy. But the main thing that finally marked this community as a cult was its radical deviation from Amish values of humility, forgiveness, and peace. Former participants reported that Mulet forced sinners to sleep in chicken coops and barns, demanded money for forgiveness, and even entered into relationships with the wives of other men, essentially using his power as leverage for sexual exploitation. This group became a direct contradiction of Amish ideals, replacing simplicity, modesty, and mutual aid with control, violence, and abuse. Jehovah's Witnesses. The history of this movement began in the 1870s in industrial America, in the small town of Allegheny, which would later become part of Pittsburgh. A young businessman named Charles Taze Russell began to doubt the teachings of traditional churches, especially the doctrines of hell and the immortality of the soul. Together with a small group, he began an independent study of the Bible. In 1879, he launched the magazine Zion's Watchtower, in which he wrote about the invisible presence of Christ and that the year 1914 would be the end of the current world. 5 years later, he founded the legal organization, the Watchtower Society. From this moment, the movement became centralized and rapidly growing. As Russell's ideas spread, the first groups of followers appeared in Canada, Great Britain, and Germany by the end of the 19th century. People distributed tracts, discussed biblical prophecies, and prepared for 1914 as a turning point in history. But when that year arrived, it brought not the end of evil, but a world war. 2 years later, Russell died, leaving behind an organization with tens of thousands of supporters and no clear succession plan. A struggle for power began internally. Joseph Rutherford, a lawyer later known as Judge, won. In 1918, against the backdrop of war censorship and anti-war hysteria, Rutherford and 7 other leaders of the organization were arrested for publishing a book that condemned Christian participation in the war. They were sentenced to 20 years in prison. They were released a year later after the sentence was canceled, but the fact itself gave the movement a reputation as troublesome. In 1931, Rutherford introduced a new name, Jehovah's Witnesses. This was a step that separated the organization from other groups previously called Bible students and emphasized their key idea: to be a witness of God, whose name, according to their translation, is Jehovah. Soon, a second, much heavier wave of pressure began. In Nazi Germany, the witnesses refused to salute Hitler, participate in elections, or serve in the army. For this, they began to be arrested en masse. Hundreds were sent to concentration camps, wearing a purple triangle on their uniforms. They were offered freedom, only needing to sign a paper renouncing their faith. Many refused. Some died. Simultaneously, in the Soviet Union, the movement was completely banned. But in 1951, Operation North saw nearly 10,000 witnesses, including women and children, deported to Siberia without trial, just for their affiliation. Throughout the 20th century, the movement lived in anticipation. New dates for a possible end were periodically named, first 1914, then 1925, then 1975. Each failed prediction led to the departure of some members, but the organization continued to grow. By the end of the century, the witnesses had millions of followers and hundreds of branches worldwide. However, in the 21st century, history repeats itself. In 2017, Russia's Supreme Court banned the organization, recognizing it as extremist. Searches, arrests, and criminal cases began, essentially a complete return to underground operation. And behind all this stands the same idea: preaching about the coming kingdom of God, a history where faith discipline and apocalyptic expectations intersect with state interests and often end in prison. Synanon. It all started in 1958. On the coast of California, a former alcoholic named Chuck Dederick opened a new rehabilitation program for drug addicts. It was called Synanon. The method was simple: isolation from society, communal living, and a special element called the game. This was a harsh group session where participants took turns being openly condemned by others. It was believed that this way, a person would drop their masks and be purified. Initially, Synanon was taken seriously. The program was supported by courts, and addicted teenagers were sent there. The network of centers grew. By the early 60s, Synanon houses appeared all over California. But over time, the organization began to change. In 1968, Dederick declared that there was no such thing as an ex-addict. The idea of rehabilitation faded into the background. Now, Synanon was supposed to become a new alternative society. Internal rules began to form: a ban on alcohol, the abandonment of personal property, and increasingly strict control over behavior. Women had their heads shaved, and men were obliged to undergo a vasectomy. Married couples were separated by order of the leadership, and violence became the norm. Criticism was forbidden. The leader of Synanon was no longer just a founder. He was the source of truth. Within the community, there was complete isolation. Outside, there was growing alarm. Authorities began an investigation, but Dederick found a way. The organization re-registered as a religion. This gave Synanon tax exemptions and temporary protection. In the mid-70s, the situation spiraled out of control. The organization created its own security force, called the Imperial Marines. They beat those who left the commune. Dozens of attacks were recorded across California. Some former members ended up in the hospital, one in a coma. Inside the community, things were even more troubling. Children were raised separately from their parents. Teenagers tried to escape. Volunteers saved them, literally driving them out at night. The climax came in 1978. After a high-profile television report, a rattlesnake was placed in the mailbox of lawyer Paul Morantz, who was suing Synanon. Morantz survived. An investigation began. Police found audio recordings where Dederick said, "I want to see Paul in a jar of alcohol on my desk." Dederick was tried. He received a suspended sentence and was forbidden from running the organization. The others received real prison sentences. A few years later, the empire collapsed. In 1991, Synanon officially closed. It left a mark on history as one of the most alarming examples of how a good idea can turn into an instrument of power and violence. Nuwaubian Nation. In the 1970s in New York, a former convict named Dwight York created a religious group called the Ansaru Allah Community. Ostensibly an Islamic community, it was, in fact, a cult focused on the leader's personality and racial doctrine. York claimed to be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and to have a divine destiny. Within the cult, there was strict discipline, control over families, and polygamy. By the 1980s, the cult changed direction. Islamic motifs were gradually supplanted by ancient Egyptian imagery, alien theories, and elements of Black racial mythology. The sect received a new name, the Nuwaubian Nation. Followers believed they originated from an extraterrestrial civilization on the planet Risk, and that white people were the result of a genetic error or the spawn of reptiles. York declared himself not just a prophet, but an extraterrestrial being. He published dozens of books in which history, genetics, esotericism, and conspiracy theory were interwoven randomly. Faith replaced factual documentation as religion. The sect grew. In the early 90s, York moved to Georgia and built a city on 470 acres of land called Tama-Re. It featured pyramids, sphinxes, obelisks, and statues of Egyptian gods. Followers lived communally and called the territory a sovereign state. Authorities and journalists were denied entry. Pressure tactics, threats, arson, and intimidation were directed at local officials. But the real problem was internal. Starting in the late 90s, county doctors began recording mass births to underage girls connected to Tama-Re. The girls remained silent. It would later emerge that York himself was the father of many of the children. In 2002, the FBI arrested him. Weapons, documents, and testimonies from dozens of former followers were found inside the complex. He was accused of sexual abuse. Details of control over families and violence in closed quarters were heard in court. In 2004, Dwight York received 135 years in prison. The Tama-Re complex was confiscated, its pyramids torn down, and the sect dissolved. A few dozen followers still believe York is innocent. The Nubian nation no longer exists. All that remains of the Egyptian temple in the Georgia woods are satellite images, press archives, and a federal court verdict. Level 2. Water's surface system. Space. In 2017, a strange website appeared online, systemspace.link. At first glance, just another digital art project, but a complex ideology was hidden behind the simple interface. The world we live in is supposedly just one of many systems, and this system, according to the site's creator, is destined for deletion. The project's author, a teenager from the Netherlands under the pseudonym Tsuki, stated that our world, called life, was about to be shut down, and people's souls would disappear without a trace. Salvation was possible by registering and, upon death, transitioning to another system, LFE. He called this procedure migration and death disconnection, describing the promised afterlife universe as an ideal cyberpunk world where a person could do anything. The platform offered users a choice: to stay in reality or join the new digital existence. Participants received a sequence number and migrant status. Their own terminology, visual style, and even a pseudo-religion, Sukiism, emerged. Many perceived the project as an ARG, an alternate reality interactive game, but there were those who believed it seriously. On Reddit and 4chan forums, Tsuki's teachings began to be discussed. Some considered it a philosophy, others a cult trap. Amidst the discussions, a troubling question arose. If the promise of a new life is given after death, how far would believers go? The answer came quickly. In August 2017, a 17-year-old boy named Jake Fair was found dead in Canada. He was registered on systemspace.link and, according to his family, was actively interested in the project. Notes mentioning the LFE system remained on his desktop. After this incident, the project went silent. The site was closed. Tsuki disappeared from the public sphere. Some still consider it a mere joke, a hoax launched without malicious intent. Others see it as a full-fledged digital cult with its own mythology, terminology, and belief in salvation through death. Final Fantasy VII, House, in the early 2000s in the US against the backdrop of fascination with Japanese RPGs and online role-playing cosplay, one of the internet's strangest cults was born. They called it Final Fantasy VII House after the cult video game. But in reality, it was not a game. A woman named Jen was at the helm. She claimed to be the reincarnation of Jehovah, the villain character from Final Fantasy VII. Through forums and chats, she sought out vulnerable fans and convinced them that they, too, were the embodiments of the game's heroes. Thus, Zach, Sephiroth, and Aerith became real people, at least in her eyes. Once trust was established, Jen invited them to move in. In the summer of 2002, several people settled in an apartment in Pennsylvania. They lived as characters, under fictitious names and fictitious roles. But the rules were dictated by Jen. She did not work and demanded money for food, housing, and magical tools. The residents slept on the floor, ate leftovers, and collected coupons. The house was not cleaned and they rarely bathed. The smell, a mix of dirt, unwashed bodies, and cheap incense, became the norm. At night, the residents were woken up. Jen would order them to set up magical shields in the yard or participate in rituals, such as sitting in a tub of green water to activate magic. Contact with the outside world was cut off. Attempts to step out of character were punished. One participant confessed that when he disobeyed an order, he was locked in a dark room to, quote, remember his past life. Another was forced to sleep in his character's clothes. Otherwise, you are violating the canon. Jen explicitly told some that she had sprinkled aphrodisiacs into their food. Refusal was equivalent to betrayal. One by one, the residents couldn't bear it. One escaped barefoot with $5 in his pocket. He said that being homeless was easier than one more day in that house. The story only surfaced years later, thanks to an anonymous website, Stalking Jen, where former participants began to share their memories. It was there that episodes of manipulation, control, and humiliation were first described. It was there that the cult was first given a name. Jen supporters tried to cover their tracks, deleting old posts, harassing witnesses. But the internet remembers. Final Fantasy VII. House became a frightening reminder. Sometimes, a fictional world is more dangerous than the real one, especially when someone decides they are God in their own game. Gorny Jerusalem, the Penza Hermits. In the 1990s, against the backdrop of the spiritual chaos following the collapse of the USSR, one of the strangest and most frightening religious communities in Russia emerged. It called itself the Russian True Orthodox Church. At its head was an elderly novice named Antonina Elena. To her followers, she was not just a mentor. She was considered the embodiment of the Mother of God, and they called her Mother Antonina. She and her closest associate, a former designer named Pyotr Kuznetsov, proclaimed that the official church had betrayed the truth and that Russia would soon fall under the Antichrist's power. The ideology was radical. Television was the window of Satan, a passport was the mark of the beast, and money barcodes were all considered preparation for the apocalypse. Sect members refused medicine, food aid, and social services. They lived in isolation and prepared for the end of the world. By 2007, the occultists had settled in a remote village in the Penza region. There, according to Kuznetsov, the decisive moment was supposed to arrive. In October, upon a sign from above, 35 people, men, women, and children, literally went underground. They dug a homemade bunker and declared they would stay there until the second coming. Authorities tried to persuade them to come out. Rescuers, priests, and police waited outside. But the hermits threatened, "If you come near us, we will blow ourselves up." Weeks passed, and winter arrived. Underground, there was dampness, a lack of candles, and poor air quality. Kuznetsov had been arrested by this time. He himself never entered the bunker. He was declared insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. The community was now managed by 82-year-old Antonina, the woman revered as the new Mother of God. children in the underground fell ill, and people began to die. In the spring of 2008, the bunker began to collapse. Part of the ceiling caved in. First, women and the sick emerged, then a few more people, but the most fanatical continued to wait. The last 9 people came to the surface only in May, after almost half a year underground. By this time, 2 had already died. Shortly after the evacuation, the entrance to the cave was blown up to prevent anyone from returning. Kuznetsov remained in the clinic. As for the others, some returned to life, and some disappeared. The coconut cult. In the early 20th century, a German pharmacist and writer, August Engelhardt, left Europe to build his version of paradise. He went to the other side of the world, to the tropics, where he decided to found a sect called the Sonnenorden, or the Order of the Sun. The main principle was absolute naturalness, rejection of clothes, civilization, and cooked food. The only permissible food was the coconut. Engelhardt called it the divine plant, created by nature specifically for man. He settled on the island of Cabocon, today part of Papua New Guinea. There, he set up a hut, discarded his clothes, and began to build a new life. The sun and the coconut were the 2 pillars of his philosophy. In his conviction, the coconut was the ideal food that purified the body and brought a person closer to God. He even compared the coconut to the human head, claiming this was why nature created it for our nourishment. Engelhardt wrote letters all over Europe, inviting like-minded people, and people did come. They were musicians, students, and vegetarians. They took off their clothes, sunbathed, ate only coconuts, and believed they were building the future of humanity. But very soon, it became clear. The coconut was not salvation. The first followers began to lose strength. One died of exhaustion, another from fever. After a shipwreck, people fell ill, died, or ran away. The tropical climate, the single-item diet, and the complete absence of medicine quickly destroyed their bodies and minds. Engelhardt continued to stand his ground. When he developed ulcers, he blamed mosquitoes and negative vibrations. When his comrades died, he said they had violated the purity of the diet. By 1907, he was almost alone. His body was emaciated, his muscles atrophied. His weight, at 5'5", dropped below 88 lbs. The authorities of the German colony closed access to the island, curtailed agitation, and effectively banned the Order of the Sun. But Engelhardt did not give up. He continued to write manifestos, dreaming of a network of coconut communes around the world, but no one responded anymore. He lived on Cabocon for another 12 years in solitude, with a coconut in his hands and the sun overhead. In 1919, he was found dead, weighing less than 66 lbs, with tropic ulcers and signs of severe exhaustion. Thus ended one of the strangest cults of the early 20th century. Brother Stare. In the 1980s, a voice predicting the imminent end of the world appeared on American radio. Its owner was Ralph Gordon Stare, better known as Brother Stare. He called himself the prophet of the last days, sent by God to prepare humanity for the coming of Jesus. His program, Overcomer Ministry, aired on dozens of stations worldwide, including Africa, Asia, and Europe. He preached around the clock, repeating a simple mantra: "Repent, time is up." In 1990, he settled in South Carolina, buying an abandoned motel and turning it into a closed commune. He urged his followers to sell their property, renounce money, forget their families, and dedicate themselves to serving God through him, his prophecy, and his order. On the sect's territory, men worked in the fields, women cooked, and children were educated according to his rules. Brother Stair controlled literally everything, from diet and sleep to clothing and communication with the outside world. He rejected medical assistance, saying pain was a test from God. Meanwhile, Stair continued broadcasting and simultaneously faced a growing number of accusations. Women, former members of the commune, spoke about sexual harassment and abuse, including during so-called spiritual sessions. Some episodes were video recorded. In 2002, Stair was arrested and officially pleaded guilty, but was released on a $750,000 bond. However, even this did not stop his activities. He continued to host his broadcasts, record messages, and run the commune as if nothing had happened. Local and federal authorities received complaints, but the legal machine moved slowly, and Stair still had a large listener base, estimated to be tens of thousands worldwide. In the last years of his life, Stair's health deteriorated, but he continued to work, recording sermons even from his hospital bed. He died in May 2021 at the age of 87. His death was the end of an era for the sect, but not the end of his teaching. After his death, part of the community remained active, and archives of the broadcasts are still available online. Citizens of the USSR. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, millions of people across the post-Soviet space found themselves in a new reality. For some, it was liberation. For others, a tragedy. But for a small, seemingly marginal group, the collapse of the Union never happened. They called themselves citizens of the USSR and still believe they live in a country that officially no longer exists. The ideology of this movement began to form in the 1990s. One of the first figures was the philosopher and activist Tatyana Khabarova. She claimed that the collapse of the USSR was illegal and that Soviet citizenship was still valid. In 1995, her supporters held the first Congress of USSR citizens, where they adopted a declaration of non-recognition of the Russian Federation and elected their own government structures. Later, in the early 2000s, other figures began to join the movement, often self-proclaimed presidents, chairmen, and KGB officers of the USSR. The central idea remained unchanged. The Belovej Accords are illegitimate, and therefore, the USSR continues to exist de jure. On this basis, activists refused to recognize Russian laws and authorities, declared their immunity to Russian courts, and massively distributed fake documents, from USSR passports to SMERSH officer IDs. Among the most active leaders was Sergei Taraskin, a man who declared himself the acting president of the USSR. His organization, the Union of Slavic Forces of Rus, built a structure resembling a cult, with a hierarchy, a USSR prosecutor's office, membership fees, and promises of complete debt forgiveness. People were convinced that the Russian Federation was a commercial corporation, and that paying taxes, loans, and utility bills was supposedly optional. Starting in the early 2010s, the movement quickly gained popularity. Cells with names like Home to the USSR, Council of USSR Citizens, and even People's Commissariat began to appear in various regions of Russia. Some tried to seize administrative buildings. Others sent mass mailings of USSR Supreme Soviet decrees to courts and tax authorities. In some cases, the movement took on an overtly fraudulent nature. They charged money for USSR citizenship, promising access to savings from the Soviet era and pension increases. At first glance, it all looked like eccentric hobbyism. But as the number of followers grew and the actions radicalized, the situation changed. In 2019, Taraskin's organization was recognized as extremist, and in 2022, the Ministry of Justice officially banned the entire Citizens of the USSR movement. Taraskin himself received 8 years in prison. Since then, dozens of his followers have been sentenced for manufacturing fake documents, extremism, and attempted self-seizure of property. However, the phenomenon has not completely disappeared. Groups continue to emerge across the country where people discuss the return of the USSR, publish Soviet decrees, and refuse to change their passports. In some regions, especially among the elderly population, the ideas of a living Soviet Union still resonate as a form of nostalgia and refusal to accept the current reality. Level 3. Immersion 7M Films. At first glance, 7M Films is an ordinary media agency promoting dancers and TikTokers. The company promised young artists careers on social media, viral videos, and advertising contracts. But behind this facade was a story that soon shocked the public and led to accusations of cultism, manipulation, and abuse. The 7M Films story began in 2021 in Los Angeles. It was founded by Robert Shinn, a man who had spent decades combining a career as a pastor with attempts to break into the world of show business. Before this, he ran a small Christian church, the Shekinah Church, where, according to former parishioners, signs of cult-like control were already evident. With the rise of TikTok, Shinn saw a new opportunity. He began attracting young dancers, promising them production, housing, and access to millions of subscribers. One such participant was Miranda Wilking, a talented dancer who soon changed her last name to Derrick and became the central figure in the future scandal. Miranda's family raised the alarm in February 2022. Her sister, Melanie Wilking, went live and stated that Miranda had distanced herself from the family, stopped communicating, and was possibly under the influence of a religious cult. Melanie claimed that contacts were strictly controlled, and any attempt to reach Miranda was blocked by her circle. Melanie's live stream sparked a wave of attention. The parents of other dancers also began to report sudden breaks in contact, strange behavior, and the participants' complete submission to the agency and the church. According to former members, 7M Films operated not just as a production company, but as a closed religious structure. People were allegedly pressured to donate up to 80% of their income, cut ties with relatives, and follow the leader's instructions. Women were encouraged to be obedient and adhere to strict diets, and some spoke of being coerced into intimate relationships under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. At the center of it all was Robert Shinn, who, according to witnesses, possessed absolute power. Shinn and his representatives denied all accusations. In official statements, 7M Films called the events slander and a family drama exaggerated by the media. Miranda Derrick also issued a denial, insisting that her relationship with her family was complicated for personal reasons and that her career was developing freely and independently. Nevertheless, that same year, former church members sued Shinn, accusing him of abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. And in 2024, the Netflix documentary series Dancing for the Devil was released, featuring detailed testimonies from former members of the community. After the series release, the case continued. This summer, federal agents searched the organization's headquarters. An investigation into possible crimes, from tax fraud to human trafficking, is ongoing. The North Shields Genocide Cult. In 2016, the suburb of North Shields, Great Britain, became the site of one of the most shocking crimes in the modern history of the UK. The story, dubbed the North Shields Genocide Cult by the press had neither a religious ideology nor a philosophy, but its cruelty and structure resembled a cult in which one person gained absolute power over another and used it to slowly destroy a vulnerable victim. At the center of the events was Zahid Zaman. At first glance, he was a kind neighbor, a man in a wheelchair who cared for animals and was actively involved in charity. He gave the impression of a quiet, responsive man who could be trusted. But all of this was a carefully constructed mask. In reality, Zaman was a cruel manipulator and sadist. He settled in the Percy, Maine area and began gathering vulnerable people around him: women with difficult lives, homeless people, and people with developmental disabilities. Among them was James Proud, a homeless man with limited intellectual capacity. Zaman invited him to live in one of his houses, offering shelter, food, and friendship. Proud agreed and found himself in a trap. Inside this closed group, Zaman established his own rules. He dictated where people slept, whom they could talk to, and what they did. His word became law. The other group members, 3 women, obeyed him without question. And when Zaman declared James Proud an enemy, they began participating in his systematic humiliation and torture. For several months, Proud was beaten, starved, and forced to perform degrading acts. His teeth were knocked out, he was wounded, and at one point, according to the investigation, he was even forced to eat his own excrement. This torture was not just an act of violence, it was a demonstration of absolute power. The horrors Proud was subjected to were comparable to the cruelty of medieval executions. In February 2016, he died from his injuries. But even after his death, the abuse continued. His body was taken to a wasteland and abandoned among the garbage. Meanwhile, Zaman and his accomplices feigned concern, asking neighbors if they had seen James, while simultaneously withdrawing money from his bank card. The body was found only 6 weeks later. Police quickly realized the death was violent. Zaman tried to blame one of the women, staging planted confessions, but the investigation soon established the true picture. All 4 participants were arrested. The court was shocked by the brutality of the crime. Zahid Zaman and his associate Ann Corbett were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The other 2 women received sentences for complicity and concealing the crime. The Kirtland Cult. In the late 1980s, in the small town of Kirtland, Ohio, one of the most horrific tragedies associated with religious cults in U.S. history occurred. At the center of this story was a man named Jeffrey Lundgren, a former Mormon, a self-proclaimed prophet, and a murderer. Lundgren grew up in a family connected to the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a branch of Mormonism. In 1984, he took a job as a tour guide at the church's historic temple in Kirtland. However, Lundgren's ambitions extended far beyond tourism. He developed his own method of interpreting the Bible, considered himself chosen, and soon began to attract followers. When the church leadership refused to recognize him as a spiritual leader, Lundgren left the church and, with his family, settled on a farm near Kirtland. There, he began to form his own sect. He claimed to receive revelations from God and to be able to interpret scripture using a chiasmic code. His followers, about 20 people, believed he was a prophet and that the land around the Kirtland Temple was the biblical vineyard that needed to be cleansed of the unclean. Initially, Lundgren planned an armed takeover of the temple, believing it would hasten the second coming of Christ. But when that plan wasn't executed, his ideas took an even more radical turn. He began to say that a sacrifice was necessary to cleanse the vineyard, and pointed to one of the families in his community, Dennis and Cheryl Avery and their 3 daughters. The Avery family was faithful and trusting. They moved to Kirtland from Missouri, sold their home, and fully committed to life in the sect. But in Lundgren's opinion, they showed insufficient zeal and restraint. They had not handed over all their funds to the common pool and were hindering the divine plan. On April 17, 1989, Lundgren organized a dinner to which he invited the entire community. Afterward, according to a prearranged plan, he and several male sect members sequentially lured all 5 members of the Avery family into an old barn. They were bound and killed. The farm was soon abandoned, and Lundgren and his closest followers went into hiding. For almost 8 months, no one knew what had happened to the Avery family. The crime was only solved after one of the former cult members, disillusioned with the prophet, informed the police about the mass murder. In January 1990, the bodies of the family were found, and arrests soon began. 13 people were in the dock. Jeffrey Lundgren himself was sentenced to death. He did not admit guilt and until the very end called himself a messenger of God. He was executed in 2006. The other participants received long prison sentences. Lundgren's wife, Alice, was sentenced to 140 years in prison, and their son, Damon, to 120 years. Level 4, the Abyss, the Rajneesh movement, Osho. In the 1960s in India, a guru whose name would soon resonate around the world emerged, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He proclaimed freedom from dogma, an individual path to enlightenment, rejected traditional asceticism, and called for spiritual and bodily liberation. His teaching combined Eastern philosophy, Western psychology, and ideas of free love. But over time, behind the bright clothes, meditations, and singing, signs of a closed and increasingly dangerous cult began to appear. In 1981, Rajneesh, along with thousands of his followers, moved to the U.S., to Wasco County in Oregon. They bought an abandoned ranch and founded a commune there, Rajneeshpuram. It was a real city in the middle of the desert, with houses, roads, cafes, police, and even its own airport. The population reached 7,000. Officially, it was a spiritual community. In reality, it was a closed system with a rigid hierarchy, headed by the guru, surrounded by his closest associates. One of the key figures was Ma Anand Sheela, Rajneesh's personal secretary, who effectively ran the entire commune. The proximity of Rajneeshpuram caused alarm among local residents. The sect increasingly interfered in politics, organized mass transfers of homeless people, and tried to gain control over nearby settlements. When it became clear that they would not win the elections in Wasco County fairly, Sheela and her associates resorted to radical measures. In 1984, members of the commune carried out the largest bioterror attack in U.S. history. They contaminated the salad bars in 10 restaurants in the Dalles with salmonella to disrupt the election, reduce turnout, and thus influence the outcome of the vote. As a result, 751 people were infected. Dozens were hospitalized. The attack did not achieve its goal. Local residents only united, and the attempt to undermine democracy attracted the attention of federal authorities. A year later, Rajneesh unexpectedly broke his silence and accused Sheela of a number of crimes, from poisoning and wiretapping to organizing attacks. She fled to Europe, but was found, extradited, and convicted. She was sentenced to 20 years, but was released after only 2.5. Rajneesh himself was detained while trying to leave the U.S. and was accused of immigration fraud. By a court deal, he was deported, but faced no criminal liability for the bioterror attack. After his expulsion, he was denied entry to more than 20 countries and eventually returned to India. where he continued his activities in his ashram under the name Osho. The Manson family. In the late 60s, America encountered a story that marked the end of the hippie era and left an indelible mark on the country's criminal record. This is the story of a charismatic criminal named Charles Manson and the cult known as the Manson family. Charles Manson spent most of his youth behind bars. After being released from prison in 1967, he found himself at the epicenter of the counterculture movement in San Francisco, among hippies, marginalized people, and those seeking a spiritual path. There, he began gathering a small group of people around him, mostly young women disillusioned with society. He promised them love, freedom, and truth. Manson didn't just hand out promises, he manipulated. Using drugs, especially LSD, he destroyed the will of his followers. He himself remained sober, controlling the minds of others through sermons, meditations, and isolation. Gradually, he became something of a messianic figure to them. The commune settled on an abandoned ranch in California. There, Manson began building his own ideology. The center of this system was the idea of an impending race war, which he called Helter Skelter, after the Beatles song. In Manson's delusional fantasies, America was supposed to plunge into an apocalyptic conflict that would lead to the collapse of the existing order. His family was supposedly meant to survive and lead the new world. To hasten the onset of this conflict, Manson decided to act himself. In the summer of 1969, his followers, on his orders, began a series of murders. The first victim was musician Gary Hinman. He was tortured and killed, and a message written in blood was left on the wall. It was a warning. But everything changed on the night of August 9th. A group of 4 people, including Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Charles Tex Watson, broke into a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. Pregnant actress Sharon Tate, the wife of director Roman Polanski, and her friends were there. All 5 were brutally murdered. The word pig was written on the door. The next day, another attack was carried out. This time, the victims were the LaBiancas, a wealthy Los Angeles couple. They were tied up and killed. Messages written in blood reappeared on the walls: death to pigs and helter skelter. Manson himself did not personally participate in these murders, but he was the one giving the orders. He controlled his followers like puppets. They acted on his instructions without asking questions. The investigation initially moved slowly, but in the fall of 1969, police arrested several family members for car theft. Later, one of the girls began boasting in jail about her involvement in the murders, and the case gained momentum. The trial of Manson and his accomplices became one of the most high-profile cases of the decade. The defendants behaved defiantly, staging theatrical performances and carving crosses, later turned into swastikas, on their foreheads. In January 1971, Manson and 3 of his associates were sentenced to death. Later, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment when the death penalty was temporarily abolished in California. Charles Manson died in 2017 in a prison hospital. His name became synonymous with manipulative cruelty and the destructive power of charisma. Closing remarks. That's all for today. Thank you very much for watching.